The first thing they never tell you about humans at war is the singing. I could hear it through the walls of my quarters aboard the ISV Ardent Wake, the night before the entire 4th Combined Assault Brigade was scheduled to drop onto a planet none of them might walk off alive. I pressed my ear against the cold metal and listened. Dozens of voices, maybe more, rising and falling together in a melody I did not recognize. It was not a hymn. It was not a battle chant. It was something else entirely. Something my people have no word for, and the sound of it made my stomach turn in a way I could not explain. My name is Velen Sorith. I am a military analyst for the Galactic Concord, species designation Teolosian, and I was sent here to do one simple thing: observe, document, report. That was the assignment Director Rethon gave me 6 weeks ago in his office on Helios Station, while I sat across from him and tried every argument I could think of to avoid it. I had written a paper. That was my mistake. 14 pages of statistical analysis flagging a pattern that nobody in the Concord had been able to explain. Human ground forces were surviving engagements at rates that defied every combat model we had. Battles where casualty projections said total loss. Humans were walking out with 60, 70, sometimes 80% of their forces intact. The numbers did not make sense. I said so in the paper. I suggested further study. Rethanon read it, called me to his office, and told me I was going to conduct that further study personally, on the ground, embedded with a human combat unit. I told him I was a desk analyst. I told him I had never left Helios Station in 4 years. I told him that Teolosians were not built for ground combat environments. Our bones are light. Our respiratory system cannot handle particulate-heavy air for extended periods. Our pain tolerance is, by galactic standards, embarrassingly low. He told me the transport left in 3 days. So here I was, aboard a human warship that smelled like metal and sweat, and something sweet I later learned was coffee, listening to soldiers sing the night before they were scheduled to fight their way into a Krethak hive fortress on a colony world called Dust Valen. The Krethak Dominion had occupied the planet 8 months ago. They were an insectoid species, aggressive, expansionist, and utterly without mercy. The colony had a population of 19,000. Concord Intelligence estimated that fewer than 7,000 were still alive, locked in underground emergency shelters beneath the capital city. The Krethak had built their fortress directly on top of the city, a massive organic structure of hardened resin and biosteel, bristling with anti-air batteries and swarming with warrior-cast drones. Any other Concord species would have solved this problem from orbit. One concentrated bombardment, and the fortress would be ash. The colonists in the shelters would die, of course, but that was an acceptable calculation. 7,000 lives against the cost of a full ground assault. The math was clean. The humans refused to do the math. Commander Luca Ferrin briefed the operation the previous afternoon in the main hangar bay. I stood at the back, my recording equipment running, surrounded by over 300 soldiers who listened with a focus that surprised me. Ferrin was a tall man with a shaved head and a voice that carried without effort. He laid out the assault plan with a calm precision that reminded me of the senior strategists back on Helios, except for one critical difference. Every element of the plan revolved around protecting the shelters, every corridor of attack, every suppression vector, every fallback position was designed to avoid collateral damage to the underground structures. This meant no orbital support, no heavy bombardment, no area denial weapons within 400 meters of a shelter entrance. The humans were going to take a hive fortress defended by tens of thousands of Krethak warriors using nothing but infantry, close air support, and their own bodies. I ran the numbers in my head during the briefing. Projected casualties came out somewhere between 25 and 40%. I felt ill. After the briefing, I found myself standing in a corridor, unable to move, staring at a wall panel, and trying to remember how to breathe. That was when Sergeant Drya Malik found me. She was compact, dark-haired, with sharp eyes, and a scar that traced a thin white line from her left temple to her jawline. She leaned against the wall beside me and said nothing for a few seconds, just looking at me with an expression that sat somewhere between amusement and pity. "You are the Concord observer," she said. Not a question. I confirmed that I was. She asked what I had expected. I told her the truth. I had expected silence, discipline, the grim focus that our military doctrine associates with pre-combat preparation. Instead, I had found chaos. Soldiers were laughing in the mess hall, playing cards in the bunk rooms. I had walked past two of them arm wrestling, while a circle of onlookers placed bets. Malik nodded, like she understood exactly what I meant. "This is our focus," she said. "If we sat around thinking about tomorrow in silence, we would fall apart. We stay loud, because quiet is where the fear gets in." I did not understand that then. I do now. The next morning, I reported to the drop pod bay at 0400. The hangar was controlled chaos. Soldiers checking weapons, securing gear, running final system diagnostics on their armor. The noise was overwhelming. My Talosian hearing is more sensitive than theirs, and every shouted command, every metallic clang, every boot step on the deck, hit me like a physical blow. Malik found me again. She handed me a set of lightweight composite armor, adjusting the straps herself when my hands proved too unsteady to manage them. She checked the seals, tested the emergency transponder built into the collar, and looked me in the eye. "Stay behind me," she said. "Do not wander. Do not touch anything that glows, hisses, or moves. If I tell you to get down, you get down before the words finish leaving my mouth. Understood?" I told her I understood. She paused, then added something quieter. "You are going to see things today that your reports did not prepare you for. When it gets bad, and it will get bad, look at me. I will get you through it." I wanted to ask her how she could make that promise. I wanted to ask her how she could be so certain about anything when she was about to drop onto a planet crawling with creatures that wanted to tear her apart. But the loading alarm sounded, and there was no more time for questions. We climbed into the drop pod, 12 soldiers in a metal shell, barely larger than my quarters on Helios. The seats were hard, the restraints cut into my shoulders. The air tasted like recycled adrenaline. Around me, the soldiers went through their final checks with practiced efficiency. Some whispered to themselves, some closed their eyes. One young private across from me was moving his lips in what I recognized, from my cultural briefings, as a prayer. The pod sealed. The countdown began. I had read about drop pod insertions. I had studied the technical specifications, the G-force tolerances, the atmospheric entry profiles. None of it prepared me for the reality. When the clamps released and we fell, my stomach lurched into my throat and stayed there. The pod screamed as it hit the atmosphere, vibrating so hard my vision blurred. Heat warnings flashed on the interior panels. Someone near the back was counting down altitude in a steady voice, and I clung to those numbers like a lifeline. Then something hit us. The pod lurched sideways. A sound like tearing metal filled the cabin. Warning lights went from amber to red. The soldier counting altitude stopped mid-number, and for one horrible second, there was nothing but the shriek of damaged hull plating and the roar of wind finding its way through cracks that should not have existed. Malik grabbed my restraint harness with one hand and braced her other arm across my chest. The pod was spinning now, not the controlled descent from the briefing, but a wild tumble that threw my body against the straps hard enough to bruise. I looked at her face, expecting fear. What I saw instead made no sense to me at the time. She was grinning, not the manic expression of someone who had lost their grip on reality, but something else, something fierce and alive, and completely terrifyingly human. "Hold on," she said, and the ground came up to meet us like a fist. The pod hit dirt at an angle that was not in any operational manual. The impact threw me forward against my restraints so hard I felt something crack in my chest. Emergency foam deployed from the ceiling, filling the gaps between bodies, cushioning us in a thick white chemical cocoon that smelled like burning plastic. For several seconds I could not see, could not hear, could not think. Everything was just noise and pressure and pain. Then Malik was cutting through the foam with a combat knife, pulling me free, dragging me toward the emergency hatch. Light poured in as the hatch blew open, and with it came air that tasted like dust and smoke, and something organic I could not identify. We were on Dust Valen. I stumbled out of the wrecked pod and fell to my knees on cracked earth. The sky above was a sickly amber, choked with smoke from the bombardment runs that had preceded the drop. In the distance, I could see the hive fortress rising from the basin like a tumor on the landscape. It was worse than the surveillance images. Massive, dark, its surface glistening with a wet organic sheen, towers and spires jutting at unnatural angles. Malik hauled me to my feet. Around us, other soldiers were pulling themselves from the wreckage. I counted 7, including Malik and myself. 7 out of 12. The pod had come down 2 kilometers east of the primary landing zone, and we could hear the battle already. A distant thunder of weapons fire, punctuated by the sharper cracks of energy weapons that I recognized from the Krethak combat files. Malik was on her communication unit immediately, calling in our position, requesting route guidance to link up with the main force. While she talked, a broad-shouldered corporal named Hadley Voss organized the remaining soldiers into a defensive perimeter. He moved with a calm authority that seemed impossible, given that we had just fallen out of the sky in a metal coffin. I tried to activate my recording equipment. My hands would not stop shaking. I managed to get the primary sensor running on the 3rd attempt, and began logging atmospheric data, terrain features, the distant sound signatures of the battle. Familiar work, analytical work, something to anchor my mind while the rest of me wanted to curl into a ball and scream. Malik finished her communication and gathered us. She explained that the main force had landed on target and was advancing toward the fortress. Our job was to move west and link up with them at the staging point on the basin rim, 2 kilometers through terrain that had not been fully cleared. She said it like it was a walk to the mess hall. We moved out in a loose formation, Voss on point, Malik at my shoulder. The landscape of Dustvalen was flat and broken, cracked earth and scattered rubble from the colonial structures the Krethak had demolished during their occupation. I could see the remains of buildings, torn apart and incorporated into the organic growth that spread outward from the fortress like veins. We covered maybe 400 meters before the Krethak found us. The first sign was a sound, a clicking, chittering noise that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Voss raised a fist and the column stopped. I watched his head turn slowly, scanning the terrain, his weapon tracking with his eyes. The clicking grew louder. Then the ground to our left erupted. They came up from below, 4 Krethak warrior drones, each one the size of a large human, covered in dark chitin armor, moving on 6 limbs with a speed that my brain refused to accept. Their mandibles were open, revealing rows of serrated inner teeth, and they made a sound that I can only describe as a scream, translated into frequencies that bypassed my ears and hit something deeper. The humans opened fire before I could process what I was seeing. The noise was catastrophic. Concussive bursts of kinetic rounds tearing through the air, impacts sparking off chitin, the wet sounds of rounds finding gaps in natural armor. I stood frozen, my legs locked, my vision tunneling down to a narrow point. Something slammed into me from the side. Voss. He threw me behind a chunk of collapsed wall and pinned me there with one arm while firing his weapon with the other. I could feel each shot through his body, the recoil traveling through his arm and into my chest. He did not look at me. He did not speak to me. He just held me down and kept shooting. It was over in seconds. 4 Krethak lay dead on the broken ground, their bodies leaking dark fluid into the dust. The soldiers checked the perimeter, reloaded, and reformed the column without a word. Voss released me, gave me a single nod, and moved back to point position. Nobody mentioned that he had exposed himself to save me. Nobody treated it as remarkable. I made a note in my log. First combat observation. Human soldiers display immediate protective response toward non-combatants, even at personal risk, without apparent calculation or hesitation. I did not yet understand how important that observation would become. We reached the basin rim 40 minutes later. The staging point was organized chaos. Hundreds of soldiers, vehicles, mobile command units, medical stations already receiving the first wave of casualties from the advance teams. The noise was a wall of sound that hit me like a physical force. Shouted orders, the whine of charging weapons, the distant percussion of the ongoing assault, and underneath it all, the constant chatter of communication channels bleeding from every command unit. Commander Farron was at the center of it, standing over a holographic terrain map, directing the advance with sharp, precise commands. When Malik reported in, he barely glanced up. He noted our losses, assigned replacement personnel, and folded us back into the operational structure within 30 seconds. I stood at the edge of the command area and watched the map. The assault was already underway. Blue markers representing human units were pushing toward the fortress from 3 directions. Red markers representing Krethak defensive positions flickered and died, as positions were overrun, but new ones kept appearing. The fortress was deploying reinforcements faster than the advance teams could clear them. A medical shuttle landed 50 meters from my position. I watched them unload wounded soldiers. One of them had a piece of metal embedded in his shoulder, a jagged shard of something that had punched through his armor and lodged in the muscle beneath. He was conscious. He was talking. He was telling the medic to patch it and send him back. The medic told him to shut up and hold still. I calculated the pain response that wound should have generated. For a Talosian, it would have triggered immediate neurological shutdown, a protective mechanism that renders us unconscious before the pain can cause psychological damage. The human was cracking jokes about it. I walked closer to the command map. Farron noticed me and raised an eyebrow. "Getting your data, observer?" I told him I was trying. I asked him about the casualty projections. The map showed the advance was slower than planned. Resistance was heavier. The updated numbers were trending toward the high end of the estimates. He looked at me for a long moment. His face was unreadable. "None of it is acceptable," he said. "That is why we are going fast." I opened my mouth to ask a follow-up question, but the sky split open with a sound like the world ending. The fortress had opened fire with its primary batteries. Towers of dirt erupted from the basin floor as organic artillery rained down on the approach corridors. Through the smoke and fire, I could see the blue markers on the map still advancing. They were walking into that. I stood there at the basin rim, watching the battle unfold below, and I felt something I had never felt before in my career as an analyst. I felt the complete and total inadequacy of numbers. Every data point I had ever collected, every model I had ever built, every statistical framework I had ever applied to human combat behavior was meaningless noise compared to the reality unfolding in front of me. Down there, in the smoke and fire and death, humans were doing exactly what my paper said they should not be able to do. They were taking losses and pushing forward. They were dragging their wounded out of the fire and going back in. They were choosing, moment by moment, to keep moving toward a fortress full of things that wanted to kill them, because somewhere underneath it, trapped in the dark, were people they had never met. Malik appeared beside me. She checked her weapon, adjusted her armor, and looked down at the battle with an expression I could not read. "Ready for the next part?" she asked. I told her no. She almost smiled. "Good," she said. "Nobody ever is." Then the order came. All remaining units, advance to the breach point. Commander Farron stepped away from the map, picked up his weapon, and walked toward the basin slope like a man walking to work. I followed Malik down the slope, into the smoke, into the noise, into the war, and with every step I understood a little more clearly that I was not here to gather data. I was here to witness something that my people, in all their centuries of clean, calculated, distant warfare, had never once had to face. The cost of caring about every single life. The breach point was a wound in the side of the fortress, blasted open by the advance teams, using shaped charges placed under direct fire. I could see the edges of it as we approached, organic wall material torn and splintered, leaking thick fluid that sizzled where it hit the ground. The opening was maybe 10 meters wide, a dark mouth leading into the interior of the hive. The area around the breach was a graveyard. Krethak bodies were piled in heaps where the defenders had tried to hold the opening. Between them, scattered in the dust, were human shapes that did not move. I looked away. Malik did not. She counted them. I watched her eyes move from body to body, her lips forming numbers, and I realized she was not counting casualties as data points. She was counting people. She was noting faces. I do not know how she kept walking after that, but she did. We pushed through the breach into the fortress interior. The change was immediate and disorienting. Outside was dust and sky and open ground. Inside was something else. The walls were organic, curved and ridged, with a wet texture that reflected the light from our tactical lamps in unsettling ways. The air was thick, heavy with chemical compounds that my suit filters flagged as mildly toxic. The temperature was higher than outside, and the smell was unlike anything in my experience, sweet and rotten and alive all at once. The sounds were worse than the smells. The fortress was not quiet. It breathed. I could hear a rhythmic pulsing through the walls, a deep bass vibration that I felt in my teeth more than my ears. Over that, the distant clicking and chittering of Krethak warriors moving through the tunnels, a sound that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. Malik led us through a corridor that the advance teams had already cleared. Burn marks on the walls showed where fighting had taken place. Krethak bodies lay in twisted heaps where they had fallen. The advance teams had marked their route with chemical light strips, and we followed these deeper into the structure. We linked up with a larger force at a junction point, a wide chamber where several corridors met. Here I found Lieutenant Kale Odera and his fire team. Odera was young, younger than I had expected for an officer. He had a narrow face, light brown hair cropped short, and eyes that were constantly moving, tracking every shadow, every sound, every shift in the air. He briefed Malik quickly. The outer wall was breached at 3 points. Human forces were inside the fortress and advancing toward the shelter locations. Resistance was heavy and increasing. The Krethak were fighting for every corridor, every chamber, every meter of their hive, and they were deploying their heavier bioforms, the siege-cast creatures that my briefing files described as armored biological tanks. Commander Farron was coordinating from a position near the primary breach, pushing the main force toward the first shelter entrance. Our group was assigned to the secondary corridor, a flanking approach that would cut off Krethak reinforcements from the deeper tunnels. We moved out, 23 soldiers, plus me. The corridor narrowed as we advanced, the ceiling dropping until the taller soldiers had to duck. The chemical light strips ended. We were in uncleared territory now, and the tension in the group changed. I could feel it, a tightening, a sharpening, as if the air itself had become denser. The first contact came without warning. A section of wall to our right split open, and Krethak warriors poured through, a stream of chitinous bodies and slashing limbs that hit our column like a wave. The noise was unbearable. Weapons fire in an enclosed space, the shriek of Krethak battle calls, the shouting of human soldiers trying to coordinate in the chaos. I was thrown against the wall by the press of bodies. Someone fell against me. I pushed them upright and realized it was the young private I had seen praying in the drop pod. His name was Danny Hale, and there was blood on his face from a cut above his eye, but he was firing steadily into the mass of attackers with an expression of absolute, terrified determination. Malik was in front of me, fighting with controlled fury. She moved with an efficiency that I would later struggle to describe in my report, each action flowing into the next, firing, moving, creating space, directing others with sharp commands that cut through the chaos like blades. Voss was beside her, a wall of muscle and precision. He had switched to a shorter weapon, better suited to the close quarters, and was putting rounds into every gap in Krethak armor he could find. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. When it was over, 3 of our soldiers were down, 2 wounded, 1 dead. A woman named Sergeant Claire Dunn, who I had seen playing cards in the bunk room the night before, who had laughed at something another soldier said, and thrown her head back and clapped her hands together. She was lying on the organic floor of a Krethak hive fortress, with a hole in her chest, and her eyes open and empty. Odera checked her, confirmed what everyone already knew, and closed her eyes with 2 fingers. Then he took her identification tags, put them in his pocket, and ordered the column to keep moving. I watched him do this. I watched the mechanical precision of it, the way his hands did not shake, the way his voice did not crack. And then I watched him turn away and saw his jaw clench so hard the muscles in his neck stood out like cables, and I understood that the steadiness was not absence of feeling, it was feeling contained by force of will. We pressed deeper, the corridors branched and twisted, and the Krethak attacks became more frequent. Hit-and-run strikes from side passages, ambushes from above where warrior drones dropped from ceiling cavities, sustained firefights at choke points where larger groups of defenders had dug in. Each engagement added to my data and subtracted from my understanding. I watched humans do things that my models said were impossible. A soldier named Grant Perry took a Krethak blade across his forearm, deep enough to see bone, and kept fighting for another 4 minutes, until the engagement ended, and a medic could reach him. The pain alone should have rendered him combat ineffective. He told the medic it was not that bad. I watched 2 soldiers carry a wounded comrade between them, through 300 meters of contested corridor, alternating between running and shooting with their free hands, never once considering leaving him behind. The tactical cost was enormous. They moved at half speed, exposed themselves repeatedly, and consumed ammunition at an unsustainable rate. Any Concord commander would have ordered the wounded soldier left with a beacon for later recovery. The humans did not even discuss it. I began recording voice notes because my hands were too unsteady to type. I spoke into my recorder in Tylotian, describing what I was seeing in the clinical language of my training, and the words felt hollow and wrong. I was describing a fire by listing the chemical properties of combustion. The numbers were correct, and they meant nothing. We reached a large chamber, and the fighting intensified to a level I had not thought possible. Krethak defenders had fortified the position, building barriers of hardened resin across the approaches. Behind the barriers, warrior drones were massed in ranks, supported by 2 siege-cast bioforms that nearly filled the chamber. These creatures were nightmares given form, 3 meters tall, covered in layered armor plate, with forelimbs that ended in bony blades, capable of cutting through composite armor like paper. Odera assessed the situation in seconds and made his call. Concentrated fire on the left barrier, breaching charges on the right, suppression on the siege cast to keep them pinned while the infantry cleared the drones. The assault was coordinated violence on a scale I could not process in real time. I crouched behind a wall section and watched humans charge into a room full of things that wanted to kill them. The siege cast creatures roared, a sound that shook dust from the ceiling, and swung their blade arms in sweeping arcs that forced the soldiers to dive and roll and keep firing from the ground. One of the creatures broke through the suppression line. It came through the left flank like a battering ram, scattering soldiers, its armored head lowered. It was heading directly for the knot of wounded soldiers that had accumulated near my position. Voss stepped into its path. I do not know how else to describe what happened. He simply stepped forward, planted his feet, and opened fire at point-blank range into the creature's face. The rounds sparked and ricocheted off the heavy chitin plating. The creature barely slowed. It swung one massive blade arm, and Voss threw himself sideways, rolled, came up firing again. Other soldiers joined in, pouring fire into the creature from multiple angles, finding the gaps between its armor plates. It stumbled. It screamed. Voss put a final burst into the soft tissue beneath its jaw, and it collapsed 2 meters from the wounded soldiers it had been about to crush. Voss stood over it, breathing hard, blood running from a gash on his leg, where the blade arm had caught him. He looked down at the dead creature, then turned to check on the wounded soldiers behind him. "You all right back there?" he asked. Like it was nothing. Like he had not just thrown himself in front of a biological tank to protect people who could not protect themselves. Like this was just what you did. The chamber was cleared. We had lost 2 more. 7 wounded, being treated by a medic named Corporal Nina Garza, who moved between patients with a calm focus that defied the carnage around her. I watched her set a broken bone, seal a puncture wound, and administer pain medication to 3 soldiers in under 4 minutes, her hands never hesitating, her voice a constant stream of reassurance. "You are doing great. Stay with me, I have got you." The same words, repeated with the same steady warmth, as if each wounded soldier was the only person in the room. We pushed on. We had to. The mission clock was running, and the longer the assault took, the greater the chance that the Krethak would decide to eliminate their hostages, rather than lose them. Every minute mattered. Commander Farron's voice came over the communication channel. The main force had reached the first shelter entrance. Heavy Krethak presence around the door. All units were to accelerate their advance and converge on the shelter locations. Malik acknowledged the order and increased our pace. We moved through the corridors at a near run, clearing as we went, the soldiers flowing around obstacles and through choke points, with a fluid coordination that spoke of training so deep it had become instinct. We came around a curve in the corridor and stopped. Ahead of us was a wide passage leading to what our maps identified as the approach to the first shelter entrance. The passage was packed with Krethak. Not a patrol, not a defensive position, a swarm. Hundreds of warrior drones, filling the corridor from wall to wall, their chitin armor clicking and scraping as they moved over and around each other. Behind them, I could see the outline of the shelter door, a heavy blast door of human construction, scarred and dented but still sealed. And from behind that door, faint but unmistakable, I heard something that stopped every thought in my head. Children. Human children, crying. The sound hit the soldiers like an electric current. I was watching their faces when they heard it. I saw fear and exhaustion and pain and doubt, and I watched all of it drain away in a single heartbeat, replaced by something I did not have a word for in my language. Malik chambered around. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were flat and hard and certain. "This is the part you came to see," she said. And then they charged. I have replayed what happened next in my memory so many times that the details have become sharper than reality. I know this is not how memory works. I know that recollection degrades over time, blurring edges, softening impacts. But the assault on the first shelter entrance exists in my mind with a clarity that defies biology. Every sound, every flash, every face burned into my neural pathways with a permanence that I suspect will outlast everything else I have ever experienced. They did not hesitate. There was no countdown, no tactical pause, no moment of preparation. Malik gave the order, and 20 soldiers went forward into a corridor filled with hundreds of Krethak warriors, and they did it at a dead run. The first 3 seconds were pure momentum. The humans hit the front edge of the swarm with concentrated fire that shattered the leading ranks, chitin and fluid spraying in all directions. The sound so loud it transcended hearing and became a physical pressure against my body. The Krethak recoiled from the impact, their formation compressing, and the soldiers drove into that compression like a wedge, firing and moving, and never, not for a single instant, stopping. I followed because there was nowhere else to go. The corridor behind us was not safe. Nothing was safe. The only direction that offered any possibility of survival was forward, through the swarm, toward the shelter door, and so I ran with them. Malik was at the front. She moved through the Krethak with a lethal precision that my analytical mind tried and failed to categorize. She was not fighting the way the Concord tactical manuals described human combat. There was no waste in her movement. Every step, every turn, every trigger pull served a purpose. She created space, collapsed it, redirected threats, and maintained forward progress simultaneously. I had studied military science for 12 years, and I had never seen anything like it. Voss was beside her, a different kind of fighter. Where Malik was precision, Voss was force. He used his size and strength to create openings, shouldering Krethak drones aside, clearing paths with sweeping bursts of fire that carved lanes through the swarm. Together they were the tip of the spear, and the soldiers behind them poured into every gap they created. The Krethak fought back with everything they had. Warrior drones hurled themselves at the advancing humans in waves, mandibles snapping, bladed limbs slashing. I saw a soldier go down, dragged sideways by a drone that had latched onto his leg. 2 others broke formation to pull him free, killing the drone with close-range fire that sprayed both of them with dark Krethak fluid. They pulled their comrade back into the line and kept moving. He was bleeding badly from the leg. He kept moving too. Odera was coordinating the rear of the formation, preventing the Krethak from closing behind us and cutting off our retreat. His fire team fought a continuous rearguard action, walking backward through the carnage, maintaining a wall of fire that kept the swarm from enveloping us. I watched him give orders with a voice that never wavered, even as a Krethak blade missed his face by centimeters and buried itself in the wall beside his head. He did not flinch. He shot the drone that had thrown it and adjusted his team's positioning without breaking cadence. The advance was measured in meters. Each one cost something. Ammunition, energy, blood. The corridor was becoming slippery with Krethak fluid and human blood, and the footing was treacherous. A soldier named Pike slipped, went down on one knee, and a Krethak warrior was on him instantly. Malik put 2 rounds through its skull from 4 meters away, without slowing her own advance. Pike got up and kept moving. The crying from behind the shelter door was louder now. I could hear individual voices, children calling for parents, adults trying to calm them, the raw sound of terror that has no species boundary. It was the most awful sound I had ever heard, and it was the fuel that kept the soldiers moving. I understood then what I was witnessing. This was not a military operation, not in the way my people understood the term. There was no detachment here, no clinical separation between the soldiers and the people they were trying to save. Every cry from behind that door was a knife in their chests, and they took that pain and converted it into forward motion. They were running on empathy, on love, on a connection to strangers they had never met that was so powerful it overrode every survival instinct their bodies possessed. My people would call this madness. We would categorize it as a cognitive deficiency, an inability to maintain the emotional distance required for rational tactical decision-making. We would be wrong. We reached the shelter door. Malik slammed her palm against the surface and shouted identification codes, while the soldiers formed a perimeter around the entrance. The swarm was pressing in from both sides now, and the perimeter was shrinking. Voss anchored one side, Odera the other, and between them, the soldiers fought with a desperation that was terrifying to witness. A soldier named Hannah Cross went down with a deep gash across her torso. Nina Garza, the medic, was there in seconds, pulling Cross behind the line, working on the wound with hands that moved so fast I could barely track them. "Stay with me, Hannah. Eyes on me. You are doing fine." Cross was not doing fine. The wound was severe, but Garza's voice never changed, and Cross held on to it like a lifeline. The shelter door opened, not all at once, but slowly, a crack that widened into a gap, and through that gap came a wave of stale air and the sound of 2,000 terrified voices. Malik pushed through the door first, weapon up, clearing the space beyond. I followed her into the shelter and stopped. They were everywhere, crowded into a space designed for half their number, sitting on the floor, leaning against walls, holding each other. Their faces were gaunt and pale, their eyes wide with a fear that had been building for 8 months. Many of them were children, small children who stared at the soldiers with expressions that broke something fundamental inside my chest. And then something happened that destroyed every remaining framework I had for understanding humans. The soldiers, the same soldiers who moments ago had been killing with mechanical efficiency, who had charged through a swarm of alien predators with weapons blazing, who had been covered in blood and fury and desperate violence, stopped. They lowered their weapons. They knelt down. A private named Danny Hale, the young man I had watched praying in the drop pod, sat on the floor next to a small girl who was crying and offered her his water canteen. He spoke to her in a voice so gentle that I felt like an intruder for hearing it. "Hey there. You are safe now. We came to get you out of here. Can you drink some of this for me?" The girl looked at him. She was maybe 5 years old, filthy, her hair matted, her clothes torn. She had been living underground in the dark for 8 months, while alien predators occupied the world above her head. She had every reason to be terrified of everything and everyone. She reached for the canteen. Across the shelter, similar scenes unfolded. Soldiers distributing water and rations, checking on the injured, speaking in soft voices to people they had never met. Malik was talking to a group of adults, getting a count of survivors, asking about medical needs, her manner completely transformed from the lethal focus of 60 seconds ago. I stood in the middle of it and felt the world tilt beneath me. My recording equipment was running, capturing everything, and I was grateful for that, because I was not capable of coherent observation in that moment. My hands were shaking. My vision was blurred. Something was happening inside my chest that my species does not have a word for, because we have never needed one. "How do you do this?" I whispered to no one. Malik heard me. She looked over from her conversation, and for just a second her expression softened into something private and exhausted and human. "We do not have a choice," she said. "This is what we are." But the mission was not finished. 2 more shelters remained, deeper in the fortress. Commander Farron's voice came over the communication channel, steady and clear. "First shelter secured. Evacuation teams are inbound. All assault elements prepare to advance to secondary and tertiary shelter locations." Malik stood up. The softness left her face. The weapon came back up. She looked at her squad, what was left of it, and they looked back at her. And some silent communication passed between them that I could not interpret but could feel. "Let us go get the rest of them," she said. They moved toward the corridor, Back into the hive, back into the dark and the danger, and the things with blades and mandibles waiting for them. They had just fought through the worst engagement of the operation. They were wounded, exhausted, running low on ammunition, and they were going back in because there were more people to save. I followed them. I did not decide to. My legs simply moved. The deeper tunnels were different from the outer corridors. Narrower, darker, the walls more organic in structure. The rhythmic pulsing I had felt earlier was stronger here, a heartbeat-like vibration that seemed to come from the fortress itself. The air was thicker, the chemical compounds more concentrated, and my suit filters began working harder to keep me breathing clean air. The Krethak resistance in the deep tunnels was fierce but more desperate. The loss of their outer defenses, and the first shelter, had shifted something in their behavior. They were no longer fighting to hold ground. They were fighting to destroy. Tunnel collapses were triggered ahead of us, forcing detours through unmapped passages. Chemical agents were deployed, clouds of acrid vapor that burned exposed skin and reduced visibility to arm's length. A soldier named Rick Calloway caught a face full of the chemical agent when his mask seal failed. He dropped to his knees, clawing at his eyes, choking on air that was eating him from the inside. Garza reached him in seconds, flushing his face with neutralizing solution, replacing his mask, talking him through the panic. Calloway recovered enough to walk. He could not see clearly, but he refused to stay behind. Another soldier guided him by the arm, and they kept moving together through the dark. I documented this. I made careful clinical notes about the incident, the treatment, the response. And then I turned off my recorder and just watched, because some things should not be reduced to data. We reached the second shelter. This one was not intact. The Krethak had partially breached the shelter door. The heavy blast door had been forced open at one corner, and through the gap they had sent warrior drones into the shelter itself. The evidence of what had happened was visible the moment we entered. I will not describe it. I did not describe it in my report. Some things exist beyond the reach of words, and the attempt to capture them in language would diminish both the horror and the humanity of those who suffered it. I will say only this. Not all of the civilians in the second shelter had survived the breach. Some of them had died trying to protect others. I saw an elderly man lying across the entrance to a side chamber, his body positioned to block the doorway. Behind him, huddled in the dark, were 11 children, all alive. He had held the door. He was human too. The soldiers cleared the shelter of the remaining Krethak drones with a cold, systematic thoroughness that was different from the fighting before. There was no shouting, no battle cries. Just efficient, silent work, methodical and absolute. Odera supervised the evacuation. He counted survivors, organized them into groups, assigned escorts. He did all of this with steady hands and a level voice. And then he stepped outside the shelter into the corridor and stood with his back to the wall and his face turned away from everyone. I saw his shoulders move. I saw him press his fist against his mouth. I saw his eyes go red and wet. 30 seconds. That was all he allowed himself. Then he wiped his face, straightened his spine, and walked back in to continue the evacuation. 30 seconds of grief, stolen from a war, hidden from his soldiers, so they would not see their leader break. And then back to work, because there was still one more shelter, and the people in it were still waiting. I added a new note to my observations. Humans do not suppress their emotions in combat. They defer them. They carry them, like ammunition, and spend them later in private. The cost of this is something I am not qualified to calculate, but I suspect it is enormous. The third shelter was the deepest. Between us and it lay the Krethak command nexus, the central chamber of the hive where the queen analog resided, the brain of the fortress. Every remaining Krethak warrior was converging on that chamber, forming a final defensive line between the humans and the last group of captives. Commander Farron arrived with the consolidated main force. The corridor outside the command nexus was packed with soldiers, weapons, equipment. Farron studied the tactical display, conferred with his officers, and made his assessment. The Queen Analog was the command node for the entire hive. If she fell, the Krethak warrior drones would lose coordination, reverting to individual behavior patterns that were far less effective. Taking the nexus would break the defense around the third shelter. but the Nexus was the most heavily defended position in the fortress. Farron estimated a significant cost to breach it. He was still calculating when the Krethak broadcast hit. Every communication device in the corridor screamed with the signal. My translator parsed it in real time, and the words appeared on my display in clean, clinical text that did not match the horror of their meaning. If you advance further, we will execute every captive in the third shelter. Withdraw, or they die. Silence. Absolute silence in the corridor. Every soldier heard it. Every soldier understood it. I looked at Farron. I expected hesitation. I expected calculation. I expected the kind of rational cost-benefit analysis that any Concord commander would have performed, weighing the lives in the shelter against the cost of the assault, running the numbers, finding the optimal solution. Farron did not hesitate. He opened a channel to the Krethak command frequency and spoke 6 words. Then you had better be fast. He closed the channel and turned to his soldiers. Full advance, maximum speed. We reach that shelter before the kill order does. I did not understand. Malik saw the confusion on my face and leaned close. They expect us to stop, she said. They expect the threat to freeze us while they reinforce. Instead, we are going to be inside that nexus before they finish giving the order. Speed is the only thing that saves those people now. I looked at the corridor full of soldiers, battered, bleeding, exhausted, their armor scarred and dented, their faces drawn with fatigue and grief, and the accumulated weight of everything they had seen and done today. And I watched them check their weapons, adjust their gear, and prepare to charge into the heart of a hive, because somewhere behind it, 3,000 people were waiting for rescue, and the clock had just started counting down. Farron raised his hand. The corridor went quiet. Every eye was on him. He did not give a speech. He did not invoke duty or honor, or any of the grand abstractions that military leaders are supposed to use in moments like this. He simply looked at his soldiers and said, "Go." They went. The command nexus was a cathedral of nightmares. A vast organic chamber, the ceiling lost in darkness above, the walls pulsing with bioluminescent veins that cast everything in a sickly blue-green light. At its center, elevated on a platform of hardened resin, the queen analog sat in a web of neural tendrils that connected her to every part of the fortress. She was massive, 3 times the size of a warrior drone, her body bloated with the biological machinery of command. Around her, arranged in concentric rings, were her guards, hundreds of them, the elite of the hive, larger and more heavily armored than anything we had faced so far. The humans hit them like a wave breaking against a cliff. The opening seconds of the assault were the most violent thing I have ever witnessed, or ever hoped to witness. Concentrated fire from every weapon in the strike force converged on the guard rings, and the noise was so extreme that it crossed the threshold from sound into something else entirely. A pressure, a force, a physical weight that pressed against my body and tried to push me backward. I was in the middle of the formation. There was no safe position. There was no rear echelon, no observation point, no clinical distance from which to watch and document. I was inside the machine of war, surrounded by humans fighting for their lives, and the lives of strangers, and the only thing between me and the Krethak guards was the soldiers on either side of me. Malik was to my left, Voss to my right. They bracketed me without being asked, a protective formation that cost them tactical flexibility, and that neither of them acknowledged or complained about. They simply did it, the same way they simply breathed. The guard rings fought with a ferocity that surpassed anything the warrior drones had shown. These were bred for this, engineered to protect the queen analog at any cost, and they threw themselves at the human advance with a suicidal intensity that staggered even the most experienced soldiers. Bodies piled up, human and Krethak alike, and the floor of the chamber became treacherous with fluid and debris. A Krethak guard broke through the line 3 meters from my position. It was enormous, its chitin armor thicker than the standard warriors, its blade arms longer and sharper. It cut through a soldier whose name I never learned, and the soldier fell without a sound, and the guard kept coming, toward me. Malik hit it from the side, firing into the joint between its head and thorax. The rounds penetrated, but did not stop it. It turned toward her, blade arms raised, and she dove under the swing and came up behind it, still firing. Something landed in my hands. I looked down. It was a sidearm, a standard human combat pistol, pressed into my grip by Voss as he moved past me to engage another target. He did not look at me. He simply put the weapon in my hands and said one word. Squeeze. The Krethak guard shook off Malik's fire and lunged at her. She stumbled backward over a body and went down. The guard raised its blade arm for a killing stroke. I pointed the weapon and squeezed. I do not know if I hit it. The recoil nearly tore the pistol from my hands. Something struck the guard from multiple directions simultaneously, rounds from other soldiers converging on the threat, and it collapsed sideways, its blade arm slamming into the floor centimeters from Malik's head. She rolled away, got to her feet, and looked at me. There was something in her expression that I still cannot fully interpret. Surprise, maybe, or recognition, or something deeper that exists between beings who have faced death together, regardless of species. She nodded once and kept fighting. The assault pushed inward. The guard rings thinned as the humans carved through them, paying for every meter in blood and pain. Commander Farron was at the front, fighting alongside his soldiers, his command authority expressed through actions rather than words. I watched him pull a wounded corporal to safety with one hand while firing with the other, and I thought of all the Concord generals I had known, who commanded from orbital platforms and never once smelled the smoke of the wars they directed. The Queen analog reacted to the collapsing defense by flooding the chamber with every remaining warrior in the hive. They came from tunnels I had not seen, from openings in the ceiling and floor, a tide of chitin and fury that threatened to overwhelm the human force through sheer numbers. For a moment, a terrible, stretching moment, I thought it was over. The perimeter buckled. Soldiers were being pulled down by sheer weight of attackers. The noise reached a pitch that stopped thought. And then the humans did something I had never seen in any combat recording, any historical archive, any tactical simulation. They closed ranks. Not a retreat, not a consolidation, but a deliberate, instinctive compression of their formation, until they were shoulder to shoulder, back to back, a circle of fire and fury, with no gaps and no weakness. They stopped being individual soldiers and became a single entity, a wall of humans that refused to break. Malik was against my back. I could feel her firing, each shot a jolt through her body into mine. Voss was to my left, close enough that I could hear his breathing, steady and controlled despite the chaos. Odera was somewhere to my right, his voice cutting through the noise, with orders that kept the circle intact. They held. Against hundreds, against the full fury of a dying hive, they held. And then it broke. The Queen analog screamed, a sound that was not just audible but neurological, a pulse through the neural network that connected her to her warriors. I felt it in my bones, a vibration of desperation and command. Kill them. Kill them all. Farron understood what was happening before anyone else. He shouted a single order, and a team of soldiers broke from the circle, driving toward the Queen's platform with everything they had left. The fighting around the platform was hand-to-hand, soldiers grappling with Krethak guards that towered over them, using knives and fists, and sheer human stubbornness when their weapons ran dry. A demolition charge detonated at the base of the platform. The blast shook the entire chamber and severed a cluster of the neural tendrils, connecting the Queen to her network. The effect was immediate. Across the chamber, Krethak warriors stumbled, their coordination fracturing, their movements becoming erratic and uncoordinated. A second charge, a third, the neural network collapsed. The Queen analog thrashed on her platform, disconnected, blind, her control over the hive shattered. And across the fortress, in every tunnel and corridor and chamber, the Krethak warriors stopped fighting, as a unified force, and became what they truly were, without their queen. Animals, dangerous, but directionless, manageable. Farron did not waste the moment. Every available soldier was directed toward the third shelter. They ran through tunnels that were suddenly passable, past Krethak warriors that milled in confusion, their combat instincts firing without coordination. The race was against the kill order that had been given minutes ago, a command that was even now traveling through the fractured remnants of the neural network toward the guards at the third shelter. I ran with them. My lungs burned. My legs screamed. The borrowed pistol was still in my hand, and I held it with a grip so tight my fingers had gone numb. I ran because they ran, because in that moment, I was not an observer, or an analyst, or a Talosian. I was part of something larger, swept up in a tide of human determination that carried me forward whether I wanted it or not. We reached the third shelter. The guards were there, a dozen warrior drones positioned around the blast door. They had received the kill order. I could see it in their behavior, the way they were turning toward the door, the way their blade arms were rising. They were too slow. The soldiers hit them like a hammer. 12 Krethak guards against a force of desperate humans who had fought through an entire hive to reach this moment. The guards never had a chance. They were cut down in seconds, precision fire dropping them before their blades could reach the door. Malik reached the blast door first. She slammed the emergency release. The door ground open. 3,112 people, all alive, frightened, starving, some of them injured, but alive. The sound that came from the soldiers when they saw the survivors was not a cheer, it was not a battle cry. It was something quieter, something that came from a deeper place, a sound of exhaustion, and relief, and grief, so intertwined that pulling them apart would be like trying to separate water from salt. The fortress fell within the hour. Without the Queen Analog's coordination, the remaining Krethak were neutralized by follow-up forces. Evacuation shuttles landed in the basin, and the long process of bringing 7,000 survivors back to the surface began. I stood outside the fortress as the shuttles came down. The amber sky was clearing, the smoke thinning, and through the gaps I could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening upper atmosphere. The battlefield around me was scarred and broken, cratered by explosions, littered with debris. And among the debris, laid out in careful rows by soldiers who had taken the time to do it properly, even in the midst of an ongoing operation, were the dead. Human soldiers who had not survived the assault. They were arranged with precision, their arms at their sides, their weapons placed across their chests. Beside each body, someone had placed their identification tags on a small marker. I walked along the rows. I did not count them. I could not bring myself to reduce them to a number, not after today. Each one was a person. Each one had chosen to be here. Each one had known the cost and paid it. I found Malik sitting against a section of the fortress wall, her weapon across her knees, her head tilted back, her eyes closed. Her armor was scored and dented. There was dried blood on her hands, some of it hers, most of it not. Her face was still, but her hands were trembling. It was the first time I had seen any sign of fragility from her, and it hit me harder than any moment of the battle, because I understood now that the trembling was not weakness. It was everything she had refused to feel during the fighting, every flinch she had suppressed, every grief she had deferred, every moment of terror she had swallowed and converted into action, all of it surfacing at once now that she no longer needed to be invincible. I did not approach her. Some moments belong only to the person living them, and this was hers. I stood at a distance, and I watched, and I felt something fundamental shift inside my understanding of what it means to be alive. Commander Farron found me an hour later. He was tired in a way that went beyond physical. There were shadows in his eyes that had not been there during the briefing on the Ardent Wake, and I suspected they would never fully leave. "Did you get what you came for?" he asked. I told him I did not know. I had come for data, for statistical analysis, for the framework that would explain how humans survived engagements they should not survive. He nodded slowly. "Every species in the Concord asks us the same question," he said. "How do we win battles we should lose? They think it is biology. They think it is training or technology, or some secret we are keeping from them. It is not. It is this." He gestured at the battlefield, at the rows of dead, at the shuttles lifting survivors to safety, at the soldiers sitting in the dust with their heads in their hands. "We know what we are fighting for. We feel every ounce of what it costs. And we do it anyway. That is the whole answer. There is nothing else." I returned to Helios Station 3 days later. I sat in front of my terminal and stared at the blank report template for a long time. Director Rethon had asked for tactical analysis. He wanted the statistical framework updated. He wanted the anomaly explained in language the Concord Military Committee could understand. I did not give him that. I wrote something else. A different kind of report. One that I knew would confuse and possibly anger my superiors, but that I could not, in good conscience, replace with clean numbers and tidy conclusions. My recommendation was simple. I stated it clearly. Do not engage humans in ground combat. Not because they are stronger. Not because they are faster. Not because their technology is superior. Because they carry their grief, their fear, and their love onto the battlefield and convert it into something that no tactical model can predict. They do not fight despite their pain. They fight through it. And any species that can do that will not stop for anything you put in front of them. Rethanon read the report. He called me into his office. He asked if I was all right. I told him no. I told him I did not think I would be for some time. He asked me what had happened down there. What had I seen that could shake a career analyst badly enough to turn a statistical report into whatever it was I had just submitted? I told him I had gone expecting to see killing machines. What I found instead were people. Fragile, frightened, breakable people who felt everything, every wound, every loss, every scream from behind a shelter door, and who chose, every single second, to keep going. I told him the worst part was not the danger or the violence, or the things I saw the Krethak do. The worst part was that now I knew what courage actually looked like, and I knew my own people did not have it. He was quiet for a long time after that. I went back to my quarters. I stood at the observation window and looked out at the stars, and thought about the things that would stay with me long after the mission reports were filed and forgotten. I thought about Malik, sitting against that wall with her hands shaking. I thought about Odera, stealing 30 seconds to grieve before putting his face back together and walking back into the horror. I thought about Danny Hale, sitting on the floor of a shelter and offering water to a little girl, with a voice so gentle it made my chest ache. I thought about Voss stepping in front of a creature 3 times his size, because wounded soldiers were behind him, and there was no one else. And I thought about the singing. That first night on the Ardent Wake, the night before the drop, when 300 soldiers sang together in the corridors of a ship that was carrying them toward a battle that might kill them all. I had not understood it then. I had logged it as a cultural behavior, a pre-combat ritual, something to file under morale maintenance. I understood it now. It was not ritual. It was not morale. It was defiance. A declaration made to the universe itself that even if tomorrow took everything from them, tonight they were alive. Tonight they were together. And that mattered. In the face of everything that was coming, in the shadow of a fortress full of monsters and a planet full of suffering, that single fact mattered. They sang because they were human, because humans look into the dark and answer it with noise and light, and the stubborn, irrational, magnificent insistence that their voices deserve to be heard. I closed my eyes and leaned my forehead against the cold glass of the observation window and listened to the silence of Helios Station, and in that silence, I could still hear them singing. I was ordered to observe humans in battle. I regret it, not because of what they did to the enemy, but because of what they revealed about the rest of us.